Okay, so it's a pleasure to have Dror Barron, who is an old friend and faculty at North Carolina State University, join us for the second seminar of the semester. He's going to talk about pooled coronavirus testing with side information in terms of a little bit of background with Dror. He did his bachelor's and master's from Israel in 1997 and 1999, and did his PhD from UIUC in 2003. And since 2010, he has been at North Carolina State University, where he's an associate professor. His research interests include information theory, sparse signal processing, and fast algorithms. And today he's going to tell us how those algorithms can be used to talk about pooled coronavirus testing. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dror. All yours, Dror.
Yeah, Wahid, thanks for the kind introduction. I was saying earlier that I gave a talk at Rutgers many years ago. I think it was around 2005, but obviously things have changed since then. This topic, as the pandemic began, and there started to be awareness of the pandemic in January, I realized in February that of course there was an exponential increase in number of cases, and I anticipated that there would be a need to increase the number of tests. And I also appreciated at that time that some of the ideas in the group testing community are things that research that myself and my former students had been working on over the last 5-6 years could be applied to do various things in a sophisticated way. And one of the things that you'll see during my presentation is that we're using different types of side information to improve the group testing. And by improve, I mean that you can get the same quality of estimation with a smaller number of tests, or you can improve the estimation quality, or this is a multifaceted, multidimensional design space. I also want to mention that this is joint work. My primary collaborator here has been my former student, Junan Zhu, and Christina Rivera, who recently completed her PhD, also had a somewhat lesser role here. All right, so let me begin. The topic, of course, the motivation is that during the pandemic, we often hear that some combination of more tests and also more social distancing, using masks and so on, some combination of different types of techniques will be helpful in combating the pandemic. Now, regarding conventional testing, here there's a picture of the Governor Cuomo of New York, and he's being swabbed for mucus. And saliva is also possible, where people just spit into a cup. And there are different types of tests. There are antibody tests, where you're being tested for whether you have antibodies, which would probably be the case if you had the virus in the past. Or there are now new antigen tests, where the antigen tests are really trying to see whether your body is responding to the virus. But we're for the most part going to stick to the regular RT-PCR, reverse transcription polymerase chain reaction tests, where what they do, they amplify genetic material. Okay, so we're testing for viral material, and there are some challenges here. So first of all, I'm sure that you've heard in the press that there are many false negatives, there are many false positives, and if you're trying to run a testing organization and you're ignoring the fact that there are false negatives and false positives, then you'll probably get into problems in a hurry. Another problem is that it's time and resource intense. Resource, could be evaluated as chemicals, dollars, machines, etc. And then there was recent work by Kantayanis and co-authors on how much testing is needed, meaning that if you make different assumptions about the structure of a graph underlying interactions between people, namely what you could ideally get through contact tracing, how much testing do you need for different distributions of graphs in order to maintain the pandemic with an R0 and infection ratio below 1? But the big picture is quite clear. We want fast, efficient, affordable testing. So here's an idea that you may have heard about. In the 40s, during World War II, the US military was combating syphilis, but similar to now, there was a constraint in terms of the syphilis tests were expensive when bringing in new recruits, new soldiers. So Dorfman had an idea. This is a disease that a small percentage of the population were sick, maybe 0.1% or 1%. And suppose that you pull together a group of 5 or 10 soldiers and you mix their blood in the case of syphilis together. And if everybody's healthy, there's not going to be any syphilis in the pooled sample. And because of that, it's going to be negative, and a negative test will rule out all 10. But on the other hand, if anybody's positive, if anybody's sick, the pooled sample is going to be positive, and then you can retest all 5 or all 10 people. And as long as the large majority of these pooled samples are indeed negative, recall, maybe 1% are sick. So if 1% are sick and we're doing pools of 10, then roughly 90% of the pools will be negative. So 10% of the time, we need to retest individually 10 people. Not that big of a deal. Now, is it realistic that only 0.1% or 1% are actually sick during the current pandemic? Well, we hear stories all the time that tens of millions of people in the US have been exposed, maybe on the order of 1/10 of the population. However, at any point of time, if you'll actually take random samples of the population and see how many of them are positive, it's going to be less than 1%. Additionally, if you think about a surveillance program where you're testing people that are not showing symptoms. So yes, if you're showing symptoms, the probability that you're sick is probably 10% or even more in hotspots. But if you're taking people who are asymptomatic and you're testing them frequently, multiple times a week, and if I was healthy 3 days ago, the probability that I've gotten sick recently is very low, probably a tiny fraction of a percent. So when the pandemic evolved, many people started thinking about how to use group testing to combat the pandemic. Hanel and Dror, they looked at optimizing the pool size. So instead of 10 or 5, or just basically winging it, improvising, how can you have an optimal pool size as a function of the prevalence, the percentage of people who are sick? Group testing has been used in practice for COVID-19. For example, they used it in Nebraska, I believe, on pools of size 5 in April. And then in Wuhan, the city in China where the pandemic began, they were testing roughly 10 million people in a week in May. Now there are, as you can imagine, there are trade-offs here between the testing frequency and the disease spread risk. If you test frequently, you can mitigate the disease better. And if you don't test frequently, it's harder to mitigate the disease. And there are also non-adaptive approaches, which I'll be getting into soon. So what are these non-adaptive group testing approaches? The Dorfman testing, which was this idea from the 40s, is that, again, you have samples, you pool them together, you put every individual sample in one pool, and then if that pool is negative, and most of them will be negative, you're done. You know that everybody in the pool is negative. If anybody is positive, you retest in a second round individually. So this is an adaptive approach. Based on the results in the first round, you decide who's getting tested in the second round. Now, a non-adaptive approach, the main idea is that you're putting each individual sample in multiple pools. And therefore, suppose that I'm in 4 pools and all 4 come out positive. Well, it's unlikely, if you maintain the probabilities and how many people are in each pool and so on, it's unlikely that there are going to be other people in my pools that they too are in a similar situation, that, that there's discrepancy. Does it come from me or does it come from them? So as long as we design things in a reasonable way, there's a high probability that we'll be able to determine that, yes, indeed, I'm positive. So there's, in most cases, no need for a second round. Occasionally there are going to be discrepancies, but for the most part, there's no need for a second round. And because of that, it's non-adaptive. You don't need to adapt to the first round of tests. So let me contrast the Dorfman pooling approach of the 40s to non-adaptive approaches. And just to make this clear initially, on the one hand, I'm advocating for non-adaptive, but non-adaptive has been around for decades, at least since the 80s. So it's not that I did not invent non-adaptive. I'm sort of advocating for non-adaptive. And there have been some criticisms of medical people and healthcare experts. They've been criticizing Dorfman. And I must say that for the most part, I agree with these criticisms. So that's why I want to kind of give a survey contrasting the two approaches as well as I can and to try to be as fair as I can. So first of all, one issue that we need to think about is there will be erroneous tests. The actual testing mechanism, the chemical mechanism, there will occasionally be problems. So how robust are we to erroneous tests? So in Dorfman, suppose that you have a false negative in the first round. So a false negative means that one of the people in your pool are actually positive, but perhaps they have a low viral load. And because they have a low viral load, maybe the PCR, the genetic test, didn't amplify anything. So the test comes out negative. And because it comes out negative, we don't reach the second round. And anybody who might be positive in that pool is completely missed. Because recall, every individual sample is exactly in one pool. If you have a false negative, you're done. You're not going to be identified. So Dorfman is very sensitive to erroneous tests. One reason for having these erroneous false negatives is referred to by people in this community as dilution. The idea is as follows. Suppose that in your genetic testing machine, the liquid wells contain 1 milliliter of liquid. And now, if you're putting 50 samples in there, then each one you're going to only take 0.02 milliliters of liquid. So the density of the viral material is much lower than before. So if I have a low viral load, and there are 49 other people, and they're healthy, but my low viral load is now diluted by a factor of 50, it's quite likely that there's going to be 0 viral material in that sample. The density has been diluted. What about non-adaptive pooling? So how does non-adaptive pooling deal with erroneous tests? To keep it simple, let's suppose that every individual sample goes into 5 pools. If all 5 are positive, and I'm kind of demonstrating, I'm talking through a kind of a very, very naive, a very simple algorithm, okay? So let's suppose our algorithm works as follows. If all 5 are positive, we declare that you're positive. Out of the 5 tests that I'm in, if 0 to 3 are positive, well, maybe occasionally there'll be a false negative, a false positive, but not many. So if there's 0 to 3, it's very unlikely that there were 2 false negatives. So in that case, for 0 to 3, I'll be tagged as negative. What about the case that 4 out of my 5 tests were positive? So here, it's clear that we need to think about probabilities. There's a possibility that 1 out of my 5 was a false negative. There's also a possibility that in 4 of my 5 tests, I was in a pool with somebody else who's positive. And by using information from the other people and looking at the structure of the pooling, who goes into what pool and so on, I can try to calculate these probabilities. So what we're really going to move toward is an algorithm that fuses information from all the tests and the structure of the pooling into probabilities. But the big picture here is that we're asking, yes, there will be erroneous tests. Dorfman is very sensitive. Non-adaptive pooling with a proper design, proper pooling matrix, and also a good algorithm can be made to be robust. Dilution becomes less important. Now that we understand that Dorfman is sensitive to errors, we understand that we need to use smaller pools. It's hard to use pools of 50. Actually, there was a call a few weeks ago by the US testing czar, Admiral Dror, and he said, pools of 4 to 5, yeah, that's good. 8 to 10, we've heard mixed results. So he's saying that for Dorfman, he doesn't want people to use 10. And I'm saying that I agree with him because dilution is a problem with Dorfman. But in the non-adaptive approach, again, you're putting each sample, each individual sample into multiple pools. And if there are going to be some errors, you'll run an error correction code and you'll catch them. This lets you use larger pools. And by using much larger pools, there have been clinical trials on pools of size 48. Overall, you're using a reduced number of PCR tests. So this result leads to the following illustration. I'm plotting on the horizontal axis the probability of a person being sick. Again, toward the right, 10% would mean that you have symptoms and you're in an area that's not really a hot spot. Maybe if you're in a hot spot, right now that could be maybe locations in India are definitely hot spots, then you're even above 20%. 1% would mean approximately the US, a random sample in the US right now, slightly less than 1%. And 1/10% would mean, again, you're in a testing program, you're being tested every several days, and you tested negatively last time. And there's no reason to believe that you were near anybody who's infectious or anything like that. So there's a range on the horizontal axis, orders of magnitude of probabilities of people being sick, and the vertical axis is how many tests we need per person. So lesser tests is good. Low is good. We want the curve to be low. And we have two curves here. A solid blue line is Dorfman testing. The dashed red line is non-adaptive. And the non-adaptive, the dashed red line is below the Dorfman. So below meaning fewer tests per person, we save tests. Additionally, I'd like you to note that the non-adaptive is across the board, it's better, meaning that no matter what the prevalence in either regime of people with symptoms, people that we're just testing randomly, or people that we know are probably healthy from a few days ago, through this entire regime, non-adaptive can reduce the number of tests. Moreover, the gap between the two is very significant on the left side. So if we want to actually test asymptomatics multiple times a week, and in that scenario, the prevalence, the percentage of positives will indeed be very low, this is beautiful for non-adaptive testing. Any questions so far?
Yeah, so you would often have some prior information on who's likely to be sick. Do you think about who to pool using that information? Do you want to pool people with approximately equal prior chances of being infected, or do you want to vary it within a test group?
That's a great question, because our contribution has been how to use side information to improve the estimation algorithms. We've thought less about how to design the pooling matrix for these types of considerations. We have some ideas, of course, but we've definitely put a lot of thought into, if you give me, and we'll see this in 20, 30 minutes, if you have information on what symptoms different people have, family structure, contact tracing, where you live, meaning there are areas that are hotspots, there are areas that are not, your profession, some professions, all this information can be used to improve the estimation quality, and improving the estimation quality is analogous to reducing the number of tests. Okay?
I have a question. So the question I have is, what is the expense of adaptive testing? Like, can you reuse the previous sample because you split it in pieces, like, piece of saliva to redo the testing? Or do you have to redo the testing from scratch?
Yeah, so you take the sample, you pre-process it. In the Dorfman approach, you partition into two parts. One of them is used in the first phase. The second part, if need be, if that pool was positive, is tested in the second phase.
Can you also integrate that in what you call non-adaptive? I guess you could.
In the non-adaptive, there are parts of the procedure that are done one time for each individual sample, and then you partition them into parts, and then there are other parts of the procedure that are done. So basically, I'm saying there are per test costs and there are per individual sample costs. And we cannot reduce the per individual sample costs, but we can definitely reduce the per test costs. So this is a good question, because if I reduce the number of tests by a factor of 10, it does not mean that the dollar cost of chemicals is going down by a factor of 10. From what I recall, one of my colleagues and I, we went through such a calculation. The dollar cost of chemicals goes down by up to, in the limit, perhaps a factor of 3. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Now, on the other hand, keep in mind that we're running the PCR machine a factor of 10 fewer times. So there are advantages there. There are chemicals, and these machines, as you can imagine, are currently, it's hard to buy. So as I said earlier, it's a multidimensional design space.
Okay. And the plot that you gave here, test per person for probability of person being sick, how is it derived? What's the target? Like, you know, how do you get the number?
I will, things that I'll describe later, I'll go into the details later. The first half of the presentation is really a contrast between the Dorfman testing and the non-adaptive.
Okay, thank you.
All right, more questions? Okay, so let me continue. So again, we're contrasting the two approaches. What about latency? How long does it take until we have answers? So suppose that you're in charge of testing US senators, and as we know right now, a lot of senators, including a senator that is up for re-election in my state in 2 or 3 weeks, has tested positive. So what about Dorfman versus non-adaptive? And let's ignore the fact that senators have presumably an almost infinite testing budget available to them. So Dorfman testing, it will offer a modest test capacity improvement. So as I was saying, if there's 1% prevalence, we'll use pools of approximately 10. Roughly 10% of those are going to be positive. So a tenth of the time you need to take 10 individual tests in a later round. And overall, the capacity improvement is approximately a factor of 5. But you have 2 rounds. So first of all, because you have 2 rounds, if each round of a PCR machine takes 3 hours, you're going to wait for 6 hours as basically a lower bound. However, there's another issue here. Right now, a lot of the stories that we're hearing about 5 days or 10 days until people get a test result, that's because the network is clogged. Think about a computer network where there's a rule of thumb that if I'm running at p% of the capacity of the computer network, my latency is proportional to 1 over p. So if I'm running at 50% of capacity, my latency is proportional to 2. But if I'm at 95%, it's proportional to 20. So I've chatted with multiple people. They've acknowledged that there are different bottlenecks in the network. The moment that anywhere in the network we're running at 90, 95%, you're done. You're going to wait for days. It's going to be clogged. So what happens is that a sample, when you're talking about individual tests, a sample reaches a machine and is waiting on a machine for an individual test, but you wait for 3 days until a PCR machine is available. With Dorfman, that somewhat goes away because we can improve things perhaps by a factor of 3. And I'm saying that with non-adaptive pooling, we can get another factor of 3 perhaps. So there's going to be a big capacity improvement. The PCR machines are going to be immediately available. So this catastrophe scenario of waiting a week, that's completely going to go away. Secondly, because it's non-adaptive, there's a single round, 3 hours instead of 6. So lower latency overall, and more importantly, no situations where the system is as clogged. Now, just a minor comment. I was kind of alluding to earlier that non-adaptive does not necessarily mean that you'll never have a second round. You may decide, in my example of putting every individual sample in 5 pools, you may decide, look, cases with 4 out of 5, I'll just retest them. There are not going to be many of these. There are going to be maybe 2% of the tests are going to be this way. So retesting them individually is not a big deal. So what I'm trying to say here is that non-adaptive is a tool that offers you opportunities, but it doesn't mean that you need to avoid a second round. You can use a second round judiciously, and you can reduce the latency for most of the people, and then use a second round to perhaps reduce the number of misdiagnoses. So a few minutes ago, there was a question, how did I generate that plot? So far I've been giving the big picture. Now we'll start going into the details. So I'll begin with formulating the problem, and specifically, I'll talk about a measurement channel from pooled viral material to the PCR outputs. So our problem formulation is as follows. I'm going to have a linear algebra framework. Rho is going to be the prevalence of the disease, the percentage that you're sick. From rho, at first I'm going to have an i.i.d. vector x, okay? X will mean, in the binary case, 1 if you're sick, 0 if you're healthy, so bits, a Bernoulli distribution. Alternately, although I don't have numerical results for this, X could be positive real-valued viral loads. 0 would mean no viral load, you're healthy. Positive viral load would mean that there is some genetic material. We have now the column vector X, and we multiply it by a measurement matrix A. A is a binary matrix, and an element of A is 1 if and only if the row that it corresponds to a test, and a column corresponds to a patient, and that patient's sample appears in that test. In that case, you'll have a 1 in that location in the matrix. The rest of the matrix will be 0. So not only is it binary, it's a fairly sparse matrix, practically speaking. Imagine, for example, maybe 98% of the matrix are going to be zeros. So you're taking the matrix A, you're multiplying it by A times X, and that gives us an auxiliary vector W. W is, depending on my model, either a binary model or a real-valued viral load model, W is an auxiliary variable that could have an interpretation of the number of sick people in a certain test, in the binary case, or in the viral load case, WM could mean basically the viral load in that pool. But we're not measuring W, we're measuring Y, and we have an output channel from W to Y. W are the noiseless measurements, this auxiliary vector. Y is the vector of noisy measurements that we actually get to look at. And our goal is to estimate X, either the viral loads or the sickness status, binary, from the noisy measurements Y. We know the structure of the pooling matrix A, and we have statistical information. At this time, the statistical information will be the prevalence. Later, we're going to use site information.
Just a quick question about the dependence of YM on WM. You're also assuming that statistical information is available? You have a model for, like, it's WM plus Gaussian noise or something? You know? Yeah,
and I'm actually going to describe that in a moment. So okay. Great question. And actually, let me add that some of my colleagues in India, part of their contribution to this literature is that they have realized that instead of treating this as a group testing problem with basically OR operations, you're performing ORs on elements of X in a pool. Instead of that, it's actually like a very noisy compressed sensing problem with multiplicative noise instead of additive noise. You'll see this in a few slides. Okay. So I'd like to mention that there's an analogy here that I think many of you will be able to appreciate between this pool testing problem and a communication system. Let's think first about a communication system. On the left side, we want to communicate a vector X. X could be bits or something else. We want to communicate X. An encoder converts X to W. The encoder could be linear, the encoder could be nonlinear, not important. So we have an auxiliary vector W, which is transmitted over a noisy channel. The output of the noisy channel is Y, and we want to recover X from Y. Now, of course, we know the structure of the encoder, which in our problem is analogous to knowing the pooling matrix. In our problem, X is the status of the patients, or perhaps the viral loads. There are different ways how to think about it. The measurement YM depends on the element WM, the mth location in the auxiliary vector W. We know the measurement channel, back to Anand's question, between WM to YM, and we want to recover X from the noisy measurements Y, the knowledge of the pooling matrix A, and possible statistical information. Both in the communication system and in the pooling problem, ideally, not only do we want to use a good algorithm, we also want an encoding matrix A that maximizes information flow from X to Y. So the analogies, there are quite a few analogies here to a communication problem. And for this reason, I believe that over the years, information theory people, who of course have a background in communication systems, they've made nice contributions to the group testing literature. Although from what I've seen, many of the group testing papers have actually been written by statisticians and computer science people. Nonetheless, there's been, over the years, consistently, there's been a group of information theory people doing group testing. So going back to Anand's question, what's the channel? So let's first look at this PCR genetic type of test. What you're seeing in the illustration The horizontal axis is a cycle. You're iterating, you're amplifying multiple times the genetic material. And initially you have a very low viral load. And in early iterations, you're going from an extremely low viral load to a moderate viral load. And every iteration, the viral density increases roughly by a factor of 2. So you may note that the vertical axis is the viral load basically on a logarithmic axis. So when you see something that's growing in a linear way, that really means that it's growing exponentially between iterations. Again, roughly slightly less than a factor of 2. When you have sufficiently large viral density, two things happen. First of all, it starts saturating. Instead of doubling, it grows less than linear, or less than doubles. Secondly, it becomes fluorescent. People shine light into it, they check how fluorescent it is, they actually take a picture, and based on that, they can interpolate, you're between iterations 31 and 32, you became fluorescent, looks closer to 31, we'll give you a 31.3. So people actually take pictures, and that's how they determine how many iterations, how many doublings, or roughly doublings, it took until you hit the threshold. So when is it fluorescent? And by the way, my parrot has now decided to be a woodpecker. So if you never had viral load ever, 0 times 2 is 0. You're never going to have any viral load, never fluorescent. In Europe and in the US, there are standards by the US and the European regulatory agencies that they say that you need to take 40 iterations of a PCR machine to be on the safe side. Now, if there's a minimal viral load initially, my colleagues have told me that if there's 1 or 2 molecules at the beginning, typically they need 37, 38 iterations. If you have a sick patient, typically you need between 22 up to 31. So lower 20s, higher teens would mean extremely high viral load. Lower 30s would mean low viral load. Mid 30s would mean extremely low viral load. The person is, practically speaking, probably not spreading the disease. And with this in mind, we can suggest 2 possible channels. First, a binary channel. We'll run the PCR machine for several dozen iterations. Again, 40 is a reasonable number. We'll evaluate whether it's fluorescent or not. Based on that, our measurement will be 1 or 0. And we'll have a binary input, namely in the X vector, are people sick or healthy? And we'll have a binary output. Is the test positive or negative? There could be false positives and false negatives for this binary model. A false positive would mean that, for example, I didn't properly clean my PCR machine. There was a tiny amount of contamination, maybe 1 or 2 molecules, and after 38 iterations, it became fluorescent. My colleagues have told me that, practically speaking, under some conditions, they very rarely see things that are close to 37, 38. So what they do, and now we have a woodpecker bird again. What they do, they put in a threshold of typically 34, 35. If there's more than 34, 35 iterations, they call this a 0. What about a false negative? False negative, again, would mean there's a low viral load, and I put that individual sample with a low viral load in multiple pools, and it's now diluted. Okay, so in each of the pools, there's going to be a very low viral load. So that's the binary model, and the quantitative model is as follows. We're using multiplicative noise. Now why is that? If we didn't have interpolation in the end between 28 and 29 iterations or whatever it is, then what would happen is that the number of iterations, each iteration would basically give me a factor of 2 of density. So because I'm plus minus owing to the interpolation of the brightness, 1/10 of an iteration, in the log scale, log because every iteration gives me a factor of 2, I'm plus or minus 1/10 of iteration. And this is what they've measured on using real data. They've evaluated that this interpolation is roughly, looks like Gaussian noise with standard deviation of 0.1 or variance of 0.01. Now, what they've told me is that, practically speaking, instead of getting a factor of 2 in every iteration, they get a factor of something like 1.95, but taking log base 2 is a reasonable approximation. Now there is one special case here. That special case is that if Wm is 0, no matter how many times you amplify, Ym is going to be 0. So if after 40 iterations it's not fluorescent, you call it a 0. So there are two things to highlight here. First of all, this is multiplicative noise. Plus minus 0.1 iterations are equivalent to multiplying by, or in the log space, plus minus 0.1, or in the space of actual viral densities, multiplying or dividing by something like 1.1. The second comment is that whereas the binary PCR, you had binary inputs and binary outputs, the quantitative PCR, qPCR, it's reasonable to model non-negative real-valued inputs, viral loads, and non-negative real-valued outputs, the tests. So I've told you about the model, and now I'll tell you how we solve it. We use a algorithmic framework for inverse problems called approximate message passing. And in a nutshell, you can think about this as linear regression for large, well-behaved matrices. By well-behaved, meaning that they need to empirically look like i.i.d. matrices. So approximate message passing was initially proposed by Donahoe et al. In 2009. It's a fast iterative algorithm that takes a complicated matrix problem, y equals ax plus z, and we said that ax is represented by the auxiliary vector w. So this complicated linear inverse problem is decoupled in every iteration to a much simpler scalar channel denoising problem, v equals x plus noise. In every iteration, we modify y equals ax plus z to v equals x plus noise, and the noise is going to be additive white Gaussian noise. Because of that, in each of these iterations, we reduce the impact of the noise by trying to estimate x from v. I also want to comment that this iterative approach is based on an approximation of precise message passing. That's why it's called approximate message passing. The steps of the algorithm are as follows. After initializing your estimate of x, the viral loads, as an all zeros vector, at iteration 2, you proceed as follows. RT is the residual, the unexplained part of the measurements. So first of all, you have y minus a times xt. Xt is your current estimate in iteration t. And y minus axt is the part of the measurements that you haven't explained yet. Now you also have a correction term that I'll explain its role soon. But essentially, RT is the unexplained part, the residual part of the measurements. Now that you have the residual, the pseudo-data V is your current estimate for X plus A transpose times the residual. It's been proved that V is equal in distribution to the true X plus Gaussian noise. And additionally, there's a state evolution formulation that allows you to calculate the amount of energy, the amount of squared error in each of these iterations. Basically, the V equals X plus error, how much error there is. Finally, after you calculate the pseudo data, you apply a denoiser which tries to estimate X for the next iteration, T plus 1, from the current pseudo data, VT. Here in an illustration, VT would be a very grainy version of the cameraman image. And after applying the denoising function A to T, T meaning that in every different iteration T, we can apply a different denoising function, we obtain xt plus 1, our estimate for the signal X for the next iteration. Finally, this correction term. It's called an Onsager term. It comes from statistical physics, and it ensures two things. First of all, the error in a pseudo data is going to be uncorrelated to the noise. If the error becomes uncorrelated to the signal. If the error becomes correlated to the signal, it's very complicated to denoise this thing. So number one, uncorrelated. Number two, it ensures that the pseudo data is equal in distribution to the true X plus Gaussian noise. So not only is it going to be uncorrelated, it'll be Gaussian. And there's a variety of work on denoising algorithms for estimating X from observations that are contaminated by Gaussian noise. So the heart of the matter is that the Onsager term simplifies this complicated problem with a linear inverse problem, the matrix multiplication by A into a much, much simpler problem. So AMP deals with AX plus Gaussian noise. Generalized AMP, or GAMP, by Rangan in 2011 solves a somewhat harder problem. Recall that W, the auxiliary vector, is A times X, and GAMP allows Y to depend in a probabilistic way on W. So we have a posterior channel from W to Y. So GAMP resembles AMP, and it also iteratively denoises not only X, it also iteratively denoises W. And to do so, just like we have a relationship between rho, the prior for X, and the pseudodata, and that gives us an estimate for X, similarly, we have distributional information, and we have the noisy measurements Y, and that allows us to formulate, to gradually denoise in every iteration, the auxiliary vector W. So we now have two different functions, G in and G out. They relate between the prior and X for G in, and G out relates between Y and W. So here's some examples. The simplest case is additive noise. Y equals W plus Z. Z is Gaussian. You use approximate message passing, standard AMP. No need for this G out function. The second example, binary PCR. The relationship between Y and W is a binary relationship. What is the probability that Ym is equal to 1 or 0 conditioned on Wm being 0 or 1? We've implemented that. The numerical results later in this talk will use that. Third example, quantitative PCR, multiplicative noise. The W is real valued, the Y is real valued. We've not implemented that. This is work in progress. In principle, we know how to do it. Requires some work. All right, any questions? Okay, so just a quick numerical example before moving to the last part of the talk. Here, again, I'm using a binary channel. I have 5,000 patients. The prevalence, the percentage sick, is 1%. So on average, you'll have 50 people sick. And I'm using 1,000 measurements. 1,000 divided by 50 means 20%. And that's the measurement rate R. And recall that I said that with the Dorfman approach, we can do approximately 20%, but it's adaptive. It requires 2 stages. Here, we're showing 2 different illustrations. The top panel, the iteration number appears on the horizontal axis. And as the iterations proceed, the red and the blue are the amount of noise in the output channel and the input channel, and both of them are going down. Okay, so over dozens of iterations, the GAMP procedure is reducing the amount of error at both sides of the problem. The second panel is illustrating a 1,000 entries of the actual vector. Recall that it's of length 5,000. So you can see the truth in blue X's and the estimate in red circles. And you can see that the estimates match the truth very well. So we have accurate reconstruction. Another comment is this problem of size 5,000 ran on my 3-pound laptop in less than a second. So this is extremely reasonable. Okay, nothing to worry about computationally. The last part of the talk is when we integrate site information. What is this site information? So to recap, so far I've been talking about estimating X, the patient status vector, from the noisy measurements Y, the structure of the pooling matrix A, and statistical information. And now I'm saying that oftentimes additional information, side information, SI, is going to be available. So what type of SI could be available? So we talked earlier about symptoms. If let's say that today I've been, for the most part, talking since 9 a.m., and I have a slightly, my voice is starting to feel it, then that's a very mild symptom. The likelihood that I'm sick is probably low. If, on the other hand, I have a fever and I'm coughing all the time, and I have a higher probability. Another consideration is that household members are often going to have a correlated infection status. My girlfriend and I are together 23 plus hours a day, unless one of us is taking a walk or something like that. And practically speaking, if one of us will get infected, the other will get infected within, a few hours. So not just family members, but also what if you work together with others among your colleagues? So for us who are, for those of us who are attending a Zoom call remotely, that's not a consideration, but what about kids in school? Or what about at a meat processing plant that people are working close to one another? Another issue is your address. Your address in some zip codes, they might have more of the disease than other zip codes. Your profession, meatpacking plants, again, versus professors. Information about your coworkers, are they sick or not? Contact tracing information, especially in countries where contact tracing on phones has become mandatory. So all of this is side information that could be used. Now, earlier, the X vector could have been modeled as independent and identically distributed, or i.i.d. So you can think about each of these bits in X, I'm healthy or sick, as a coin toss. But this is no longer i.i.d. First of all, the distributions are no longer identical. If I have no symptoms or if I have severe symptoms, I'm going to have different probabilities. Based on my address, all these things are giving different people different probabilities. Secondly, I have dependencies between people. For example, family members, or if I was in contact with another person and the two of us are healthy or the two of us are sick, that's somewhat more likely than one of us being sick and the other being healthy. Bottom line, there are a lot of different types of side information, or SI, that could be available. So how do we actually utilize this side information? So recall, we're using generalized AMP, generalized for, in our case, a binary channel. And we're now using generalized AMP with side information that allows us to process a non-i.i.d. input vector X. So AMP can use side information in the noiser. There have been multiple works along these lines over the last 3-4 years. And relating to the non-i.i.d. aspect, vector denoisers can support dependencies between patients. By vector denoiser, I mean you can look at every individual location in the pseudodata V, location number 1, location number 2, and location number 13 separately with different denoisers. Or perhaps if there are relationships between locations 1 and 7, you can denoise them together. Okay, so a vector denoiser means that I denoise multiple locations together, and their dependencies are going to be used in my favor. Our contribution here is, clearly for the group testing audience, we had a GAMP-based denoiser, and we're using side information. This is clear. But we actually have a contribution to the signal processing community. This is the first time that vector denoisers have been used with side information in GAMP. So the prior art has looked at non-identical distributions, and there has been work in group testing for dependent variables, but they required combinatorial complexity. As I said, on my laptop, these things run in a few seconds. So this is clearly not combinatorial complexities. The reason for that is that these vector denoisers are typically fast. Even if I have dependencies between people, denoising a few thousand people takes hundredths of a second. Iterating over that 10, 20 times is still, a few tenths of a second, not a big deal. And now I'd like to show a preliminary result that relies on this side information. As before, 5,000 patients, 1% are sick, so 50 people are sick on average. And we used different types of side information to highlight different things. Now, I'd like to emphasize that I used one set of data that was generated with all the side information that I'm about to describe, but I'm decoding it 4 different ways. In the plot that I'm showing, the horizontal axis is the number of measurements up to 1,000. Recall that earlier, 1,000 measurements with 50 sick out of 5,000 was good performance. And the vertical axis is the number of misdiagnoses on average. Recall that, again, 50 people sick on average, meaning that without anything, without any information, I can guess, hey, everybody's healthy, on average 50 errors. As I move toward the right and I increase the number of measurements, I reduce the number of misdiagnoses below 50. Now the top line, the solid blue line, all I'm using is individual information. I'm using an i.i.d. model. So because of that, I'm starting to get to a reasonable level of misdiagnoses, let's say 15, 20, around 600 or maybe 650 measurements, so 12, 13%. This is in line with other group testing results in the past. What about these other lines? So one type of site information is dependencies. I assumed that my data was partitioned into families of size 4. And again, 1% of the individuals are infected, but 1.5% of the families are going to be infected. The uninfected families are entirely healthy. And in the infected families, it's going to be i.i.d. with 2/3 of the individuals within the family being infected. 2/3 times 1.5 is 1%. Another type of site information that's being considered here is different types of symptoms. That leads to non-identical probabilities. There are going to be families with symptoms that if I have family information, then I have symptom information and family information. If I don't have family information, all I know is this individual has symptoms or not. So I have different probabilities for a family with or without symptoms to be infected, and within these infected families, I have various probabilities for the individuals. And bottom line, I have 4 different decoders here. The worst decoder, again, is no site information at all, the solid blue line. And as we get more information, we move down. The best line is the dashed red line, which includes both types of site information. And you can see that you're getting to a reasonable performance of maybe 15 to 20 misdiagnoses around 300, 350 tests, 6 or 7% of the number of patients. Another comment is that this dashed black line is the entropy bound. For 1% sick out of 5,000, the number of bits that would be needed to describe it, assuming that the tests were noiseless, would be roughly 400. In other words, the entropy for an i.i.d. model of 1% coin flips is approximately 0.08. So I need 400 tests. And you can see that, well, I was using noisy tests here. And because of that, I would expect that I need more than 400 because they're noisy. I don't get 1 bit of information from tests, somewhat less than 1. But I'm actually doing okay with less than 400. How can that be? How can I be doing well with maybe 300, 350 tests? So the issue here is that on the one hand, the measurement rate is below the entropy bound, but the site information reduces the entropy. The number of vectors that adhere to the site information is much lower than before, and because of that, the entropy condition on the site information has been reduced. But the big picture is as follows. Both types of site information can help, and it appears at this time that dependencies are more useful. So finally, last slide, we've provided an analogy between communication systems and viral testing. Our specific contributions are that we converted a pool test to a noisy linear inverse problem. This is something that others have done before. The devil is in the details. Different groups are modeling this in different ways. We use a GAMP solver. And most importantly, we're using site information in GAMP. And we've noticed that dependencies between patients seem to offer a lot of opportunity to improve basically reduce the number of tests. Ongoing work is, first of all, matrix design. I think there was a question during the talk about that. We're thinking about how site information can be used to adjust the matrix. Another topic that I already mentioned was using, just like we have a GAMP solver for binary tests, we want to have a GAMP solver for the multiplicative noise model. And finally, I'm collaborating with some other people on using contact tracing information as site information. The idea there is you'll have a matrix for every 2 people. You'll have an interaction between these 2 people. You'll know how much time they spent together, possibly 0, and you'll know how close they were during that time. And some type of function that will depend on how close they were and how much time they spent together will tell you if one of them was initially positive, what's the likelihood that the other person became positive. Okay, so that'll be it. And thanks a lot for your attention. Of course, I'll be happy to answer more questions.
Well, thank you, Dror. We'll give you a virtual round of applause for giving us this wonderful talk. So are there any questions?
Just a question about the PCR test. Does that give any information on the variant of the virus that the people have?
You mean the viral load?
Oh, I mean, the virus mutates, and obviously if you do the whole genome, right, you might find, oh, you might be able to say, look, there's two different variants here, so we think there's two
Oh,
people
okay,
infected.
variants.
But maybe the PCR test doesn't give that information.
Yeah, earlier I heard variants by mistake, variants. Yeah, no, so people who are closer to the biology have told me that they're looking for several places in the genome, and it's possible that there will be a variant that not everything is there, but by checking for different places in the genome, that's how they're accounting for this. Another more recent approach from the last month or two that's evolving are antigen tests. And in the antigen test, instead of looking for viral material, they're saying, well, if you're sick, if your body has viral load in combating disease and so on, different proteins are going to be in the body. So they're looking for the proteins instead of the actual genetic material. Now, I've chatted with some people about pooling for antigen tests. That's not clear, but at least to address answer your question directly, yes, there are, because they're checking for multiple places in the genome, that's how they minimize the probability that that type of thing will happen.
I guess I have a question about the site information model. What about a sort of, I guess one way to incorporate site information in things like, I don't know, matrix completion problems is you have like yet another matrix of features, for example, that you measured for every patient. And then you have to, I don't know, somehow infer some kind of similarity score between, do some clustering. Can you sort of, is it a way to like to turn that in, is your approach kind of like a black box that I can just, if I can somehow take that and turn it into the kind of site information you want, that it would sort of work out? Or am I missing?
We are, for us, recall that deep inside the algorithm, what we're really doing, we're calculating the conditional expectation of X conditioned on the pseudodata V. V is equal to X plus Gaussian noise.
Mm-hmm.
Conditional E of X conditioned on V. And to do so, we are not just conditioning on V, we are also conditioning on the site information. The site information is tilting our prior. Instead of a prior where, let's say, you guys have not been coughing, and because I have been talking most of the time since 9 o'clock, I have a slightly sore throat, which is very unlikely from the virus, but hey, who knows? So let's say that my prevalence will be 1% and you guys will be 0.2% because you have nothing. Okay, so
right.
We'll now have a tilted distribution, and my denoiser will know that in my case, I'm 1%, and in your case, you're 0.2%, and that'll be incorporated when looking at this Gaussian noise.
So we just have to have a way of translating all of this stuff into a prevalence prior.
It can get more let me give you through the whiteboard. I'll describe how to do one of these vector denoisers. So imagine that this is going to be my vector X, all right? And let's just look at X1 and X2. And suppose that we were informed that because of contact tracing, suppose that we have the following probabilities. We have probability for X1 being equal 0 and X2 equals 0 is, so both are healthy, is maybe 0.9. And the probability that both of them are unhealthy, sick. So suppose that you've been in contact, okay? So if you've been in contact, that means that it's somewhat likely that both of us are sick. So let's give this 0.07.
Mm-hmm.
And now let's say that the probability that X1 is different from X2 is whatever, 0.03 or 0.03 divided by 2, however you want to account for these. So normally, if this was an i.i.d. model, we would say that perhaps if each of us is sick with 5% probability, then with roughly 90% probability we're both healthy, and the probability that we're both sick is 0.25%. But now, because we've been in contact, we're either both healthy or both sick. So we've tilted the distribution. And now the conditional expectation will be computed as follows. So recall that V1 is equal to X1 plus Gaussian noise. Let's just call that N1. And V2 is equal to X2 plus Gaussian noise. N1 and N2 are Gaussian. So now we're asking, we want to calculate the conditional expectation of X1 and X2 conditioned on V1 and V2. However, the way how we're using the site information, we're also using this prior, and the prior is a non-i.i.d. prior. So we're doing all the calculations, and at the end of the calculations, we've utilized the fact that the contact tracing told us that our health status is correlated. Okay, so I hope that gives you some extra insight into how this is working.
Yeah, okay, that is helpful. Thank you.